Hey everybody, this video I'm going to show you how to create Active Directory users in bulk using a CSV file. So start out a CSV file is a comma separated value file which when opened in Excel uses just like any other spreadsheet, but when viewed in a text editor it is, as the name implies, separated values separated by commas. So for a typical CSV file, you'll have the first row as like your column headers if you were to use it in Excel or some type of spreadsheet. And then each row you'll have the information with each column separated or each cell separated by a comma. And it can be done with something other than a comma. It's still called a CSV file, but it can be a period or a colon or whatever your delimiter that you want to be. But commas are the most common, and that's what we're going to use today. So you can take that CSV file and import that into PowerShell with the Import-Csv commandlet. And if we look at the parameters, we can see that if the delimiter is something different than a comma, we can tell it what the delimiter is. But otherwise, it will assume it's a comma. If you use the use culture parameter, then that's basically PowerShell kind of guessing as to what the delimiter is. You don't have to say it. And then we have different options with headers and coding, but the simple one, we'll just go ahead and stick with path. And it can take multiple paths to have multiple CSV files, but we're just going to use one right now, which is my example that we see above, and that is in not system volume information, don't want that, users.csv. So now we can see that it's a PowerShell object in this nice kind of table looking like thing right here, and that's a PowerShell object with something that I can select, like the column headers, for example, and being able to select the object. Like so. So this is a PowerShell object that can be manipulated, selected, and filtered, different things like that, which is really good. And this is kind of forming the basis of what we'll use to do the bulk Active Directory user creations. So whenever I do import the CSV file, I like to assign the object that's imported into a variable. Something simple like users CSV equals import CSV and then the path. And when I hit enter, of course, there is no error message, but I can recall that from memory, from RAM in PowerShell by typing in the variable again. And that's helpful because you can save it and then recall it and then use different properties. Like instead of the select employee ID, we can do employee ID, something like that, and get just kind of the information that we want. But it's really helpful when doing anything else. Save the CSV into memory and then recall that variable later. So the next part we're going to go over is a for each loop. And what a for each loop is that it goes through that CSV or whatever object, each iteration of an object. And each time that it goes through, it'll do an action for each row in the table, for example. So for this CSV, whenever I do a for each loop, the first time it will go and do an action. And what we're going to do is create an Active Directory user, but it'll do an action for the first row, and then it'll do an action for the second row, and then so on and so forth, and going all the way down the list until it ends, and then that's when the loop will stop. But just as kind of a basic form of a for each loop is for each. We'll open the parentheses, we have a variable that's new, something that hasn't been assigned yet. So I'm going to say user in, and then our user's CSV. We'll close the parentheses, open a bracket, and then we're going to do something as an example. So this user variable right here, this is not assigned yet. And now for each iteration, each row is going to be assigned the $user variable. So the first time it goes through the loop, our variable will be James Smith 123001 accounting. And then next iteration it goes through, it'll have Michael Miller, and then so on and so forth down. And so it's really easy to kind of see the iteration just to simply display what the variable assignment is. And then we'll go ahead and add a read host. A read host will simply prompt you for input, but I like it when going through for each loops because it pauses after each iteration and wants you to hit enter before it goes through. So you can actually see the new object and see the for each loop go iterate through each row in the object. So we go ahead and hit enter. It's not going to do anything. Because of something. All right, there we go. So we see that the first column, James Smith, employee ID 123001, and then the next one, and then when I hit enter again, it's going to be Barbara Lopez, and then Daniel Thompson, Michelle Adams, and Deborah Roberts, and that should be the last part of our loop. And then now we're back with our little prompt right here. So that's a simple for each loop, and because it is an object and it has object properties, we could use user.employee ID and do the same thing and see that it shows the first iteration is James Smith's employee ID 123001, and then if we hit enter again, it's going to be Michael Miller's 123007, and then it keeps on going down each row in the table or each line for the object until it goes all the way to the end. So that's how a for each loop works, and then whatever you put inside the brackets here is what we're going to use to create the Active Directory user. So just to show you kind of what or how to create an Active Directory user, the commandlet is going to be new-ADUser, and if we use the dash and use the control space keyboard shortcut, we can see all the different parameters that are available to us with the New-ADUser commandlet. And it is quite a lot because there are a lot of attributes for an Active Directory user that you can set as input when creating one. But if you want just the absolute bare minimum, all you need is name and let's type in Carl for it, and that will actually create an Active Directory user, and that is the bare minimum amount of information that you need. But because we didn't specify any other information, it's going to end up in the default users container. And so if I hit F5 to refresh, I can see that that Carl user account has been created. It is disabled because there is no password set for it, so by default it will be disabled. And there is no other information about it, not even user login name or the user principal name attribute for it. So anytime user accounts are created, we'll probably want to give extra information. And we can do that from the parameters. And with all these parameters, there are kind of a few things really to keep note of. Something like, say, given name is quite easy to understand. It's just that given name property. Administrator wouldn't have it, but that'd be the first name. The surname is the last name. If you want to actually see the direct name, it'll be here in the attribute editor. So from that's the actual LDAP attribute for it. Then you can change the display name, different things like that, all kinds of things that you will have in here. But there are a few things that you should know. So if you do not specify an account password with spell it right, account password, then like I demonstrated before, the account will be disabled. If the user password is specified and the password's set, it's disabled unless it is requested to be enabled. If the password specified does not meet the requirements of the domain password policy, then the account will still be created, but you cannot log on with it until you change it with the set AD account password command or change it in Active Directory users and computers. As well as the input should be a secure string. And if I use my favorite Control Space keyboard shortcut again with the account password parameter, we can see that the type of input required is a secure string. So something like account password that simply won't work because the value is not a secure string. Even if you do choose a password, it will by default disable it unless you use the -enabled and set the value to true. So if we go and see, that did not create the user, but we want the account password, we're going to specify something like $$. And I'm using single quotes because I'm using special characters within the password. So the $$ will actually, I think, should show you a different color if you use double quotes. Because double quotes, you can have variables and different things to substitute. But when you use single quotes, it is the literal character that you put on the screen. Kind of what you see is what you get. But we want to pipe that to convert to secure string. It's going to be as plain text, and we're going to force it. So that within the parentheses, that will convert P at $W0RD12345 into a secure string so that it can be accepted as the account password. So now when we create the account with New-ADUser, we can see with a refresh that user Carl has been created, and it is created enabled with that account password. I still don't have a whole lot of other information, so I need to add that with the parameters. And as you can see here, the commandlet that I'm using is pretty long as it is. And so if we keep using more parameters for all the extra information for the Active Directory account, then it's going to be quite cumbersome, especially when scripting. So I like to use a technique called splatting. And basically what that does is you can kind of consolidate all the parameters and their values into key pairs. And it's a lot easier when scripting because it resembles more of like a column or table format rather than just one long horizontal kind of run-on commandlet. And I can start splatting simply by using a variable like params equal, and then I'll use an @ symbol, and then open a curly brace, and then I'm going to use what I'm going to do here, like name will equal Carl, and then enabled equals true, and then close the parentheses, excuse me, the curly brace, and then if I use params again, I can see it's in a hash table, so it has a name and value pair. So use get ADUser identity Carl. So there is no user with that name yet. So now I'm going to use new ADUser. I can simply type @ not $, but @ when passing parameters using splatting. And then now password does not meet complexity requirements, but I did tell you that it will create the account anyways. Or maybe it won't. So I do not have a password. So if I go back and whoops, let's steal the password from here. Delete that. So I can use account password equals, now close the parentheses. If I use, or want to view the variable, now I can see that the value is in a secure string. So if we try the new ADUser, and I want to use the @ symbol when splatting, I'll use params. So no error there, and get ADUser identity Carl. And I can see that the user object exists, as well as in Active Directory users computers, username Carl exists and is enabled, and it will have that password. So, so now we know how to import a CSV, we know how to use a for each loop, we know how to create a new Active Directory user, and we know how to pass all the parameter information with splatting to it. So now we can go ahead and look at the final script that does all of that together. So the first thing is we're going to import the user CSV and assign it to a variable users CSV. We're going to go through a for each loop. So for each line, so for each kind of row in the CSV, that row is going to be assigned the user variable, and then the user surname is going to be the first part of the name, as long as the SAM account name is going to be the employee ID. I'm going to put it in the lab users OU, and so on and so forth with the password, and force the user account to change password at login. And then I'm going to set the verbose flag on New-ADUser. That way I can actually see it as it works instead of just sitting there waiting, looking at a blinking cursor. But if we go ahead and run the command, see created users. Now it shows that I'm creating a new Active Directory user account for James Smith, Michael Miller, and everybody in that CSV. So now I want to go back to Active Directory users and computers. I look in the users OU and I hit refresh. I can see that we have all the users with the format specified in the CSV. Very, very quick. So it has the given name, the surname, as well as the employee ID as a SAM account name. And you can simply kind of use that as a very basic way to start your kind of user creation script. Of course, ones that you use in production environment are going to be a lot bigger because there's going to be a lot more information that you probably want to put for Active Directory users. But I definitely like to use this simple script as a way to create user accounts in bulk. And it's great for lab environments as well, because you can just do what I did and just create a CSV of common names and then give them employee IDs and departments to put them in, and you can kind of use that to help practice your PowerShell without actually having to experiment or learn on other people's real accounts. So thanks for watching. I hope you learned something, and if you got any ideas for any other PowerShell scripts or something that you want to learn, just put it in the comments and I'll see what I can do.